Good evening and welcome to the National Writers Series. I'm Jillian Manning, the Executive Director here at NWS, and I'm so pleased to introduce our guest for tonight, Joshua Prager. Josh actually has a special connection to Traverse City. Right about the time he started working on the Family Roe, he was part of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard, which was led by one of NWS's own board members, Bob Giles. As an accomplished journalist who's written for publications like The Atlantic and The New York Times, Josh spent over a decade working on the Family Roe, an intergenerational saga that delves into the life of Norma McCorvey, aka Jane Roe, from the landmark Roe v. Wade case. Tonight, our conversation will tackle the intersection of sex, religion, gender, and class, alongside the personal and complicated history of Norma herself and her family, including the Roe baby at the center of the issue. Our guest host tonight is April Baer, the host of Stateside on Michigan Radio. April has won multiple awards for her journalism and has spent her career reporting on issues from government and legal affairs to arts and culture to what's happening here in the state of Michigan. We look forward to spending the coming hour with you. Please join me in welcoming Joshua Prager and April Baer.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's hard to know exactly how best to bid you welcome over this format. We know it's a little bit different, but we're so glad that we can all be together in this way tonight. I'm really delighted to be involved tonight. My usual job, as Jillian mentioned, is hosting Stateside on Michigan Radio. And this book, while its subject matter is something that everybody thinks they know very well, is not. The book is called The Family Roe, An American Story. And what Joshua Prager has been able to lay out here is really remarkable. The story, like so many stories of pregnancy, is much more complicated than what you know. Despite the historic Supreme Court Roe versus Wade ruling that upheld abortion rights, the plaintiff in this case, you'll find in the book, carried her child to term. While she was not married to the father of her unborn child, she was married and she did have other children. This is really just the tip of the iceberg of the surprises that Josh has for us. And so I would just like to ask you, in joining me, to welcoming Joshua Prager to the National Writers Series. Joshua, it's really great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
This book is so remarkable, and I can't say enough about what kind of a reporting achievement it is and the level of detail that you've brought to the lives of some folks who might just mention a line or two in a standard news story, and also just the setting for it. And while I know you couldn't have predicted this, the timing for it, it's not accidental that the states with the strictest abortion laws in the US are now the battlegrounds, driving the national legal challenges to Roe. And I guess it's not accidental that many of the key players in the story that you have for us come from Texas, as everybody has been following so closely in the news. I wonder if we could just start out by asking you your orientation to reproductive rights and how you became interested in Jane Roe, as most Americans know her, whose real name is Norma McCorvey.
Well, I had never written about reproductive rights before, with one sort of sorry exception, an article that I wrote when I was in college, when I didn't know really what I was talking about. And I never thought too much about it. And I was in France 11 years ago, reading an article in the New Yorker by Margaret Talbot about gay marriage. And the article mentioned in passing Norma McCorvey. And it said that she had not been a wonderful advocate for the cause she represented because she famously switched sides. She'd gone from pro-choice to pro-life. And then it mentioned in passing that she hadn't even been able to have the abortion she sought. And I said, wow, that's crazy. And then all of a sudden it made perfect sense to me, because obviously a law case takes a lot longer, certainly one that goes up to the Supreme Court, than the gestation of a baby, which is 9 months. In fact, I then found out that Norma had gotten pregnant in 1969. She'd filed Roe in 1970, and the case was decided in January of 1973. So it struck me all of a sudden that somewhere there is a person, a man or a woman, who had been The Roe baby, as I came to learn, the pro-life side referred to this unknown child whose conception had occasioned Roe. And I had written over and again about historical secrets, people whose lives were connected in some way to some huge thing, and yet there was an unknown there. To give you just one example, there was only one anonymous winner in the history of the Pulitzer Prizes, a photographer I found in Iran who had taken a photograph of an execution in 1979. And I was always interested in secrecy, the corrosive effects of secrecy, and also sort of telling the public that, hey, this big famous thing that you think you know, whether it was a baseball game that I wrote about, or this photograph, or a children's book, or in this case, a lawsuit, is a little bit different than you seem to think it is. And so I set off to find this person. I didn't want to reach out to her if I did find her right away. In case she didn't know she'd been born to Norma, I would upend her life. Well, I did find her. To cut to that sort of quickly, I reached out to Norma. I got an email for her. She did not wish to help me because she said I needed to pay her. I explained I couldn't do that. Well, she had had a partner of 40 years, a woman named Connie Gonzalez. Norma was gay. She had had to renounce her homosexuality when she became pro-life. But this was the one woman, the one person in her life who had cared more for Norma than for Jane Roe, I think it's safe to say. And I contacted Connie. I went to visit her. And on my second visit with her, she told me that her house was about to be foreclosed on, and that in the garage, Norma's private papers were there and were about to be thrown out. And I said, wait, don't throw them out. Can I have them? And she said, yes. And then I approached Norma and I said, do you want them? She said, no, but I'll sell them to you. So I bought them from her. Those papers are now in the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, so they're available to researchers. And it was those papers that led me to find the Roe baby. And from there, my interest grew from her to the other daughters. Norma had had 2 other children with 2 other men. From them, my interest grew to Norma, to Roe v. Wade, and to the whole of abortion in America. So that's how I got into this crazy, fraught topic.
The title, The Family Roe, sets the table for what's going to happen in this book in terms of understanding more about Norma McCorvey and her background and her biological family. But it also takes on a much wider definition through the course of the book. Let's start, though, with Norma's immediate biography. This is someone who was at least the 3rd generation in her family to bear a child outside of marriage at a time when abortion was illegal and birth control was really not an option for Catholic families in Louisiana or Jehovah's Witness families in Texas, which is where her family moved when she was a child. I think when a lot of us think about reproductive rights, a lot of us don't have that kind of broader perspective of how our cultural orientation plays into it. How were you able to find out so much about the prior generations of her family?
Well, I had this idea that if I'm going to be writing about Norma, and eventually she participated with me and my work, I spent really the last 4 years of her life with her. I was actually at her side when she died. And if I was going to write about her, I wanted people to understand her and where she came from. So I needed to understand her family. And what was so remarkable was, like so many families, her family had secrets that most of the members of the family didn't know. So I sought out that information. And it turned out, as you say, that not only Norma, but her mother and her grandmother had also had unwanted pregnancies. And over and again, this larger story kept showing itself to me, the seeming incompatibility of sex and religion. Her grandmother was Catholic and then Pentecostal. Her mother was Pentecostal and then Jehovah's Witness. And these unwanted pregnancies completely redirected the lives of these women. So just to give one example, Norma's mother, Mary, got pregnant at 17. Just like Norma first did and her grandmother did, all 3 at 17. And she was disappeared from town. Her parents said, you cannot have this child. So she was made to leave her tiny town along the Atchafalaya River in Louisiana and go to Baton Rouge, where she could sort of, have her belly grow without any of the neighbors knowing. And when she gave birth, That child was then raised by Mary's parents, and Mary was devastated by this. She had to pretend that this child was not her daughter, but was in fact her niece. It changed her life. She became an alcoholic, and after she got married, she worked in bars serving drinks that to men, many of whom she then slept with. She had an enormous number of affairs, and this was the house that Norma grew up in. She chafed against the sort of strictures, the religious strictures in the home. As I say, they were Jehovah's Witnesses. And then when she got a little older, she was in trouble. She went off to a school for quote unquote delinquent children. And she then came out as a lesbian. Her mother beat her. Her mother was still living when I started this book. She told me how unapologetically she tried to beat the lesbianism out of her daughter. And so sex was something illicit and forbidden in this home. Norma then got married at 16 years old to a man, had a child. And by the time she was 22, she was pregnant. When she was 22, I should say 21, she was pregnant for the third time. And she did not want to become a mother. She had relinquished the first child to adoption to her own mother. So those cycles playing themselves out again. Norma lied endlessly. One of the lies that she told and wrote was that her mother had kidnapped her child from her. But in fact, as Norma's then live-in girlfriend told me, Norma pleaded with her mother to sort of take this child off of her hands. And eventually the mother agreed to. The second child was adopted at birth, and it was Norma's third pregnancy that led to Roe. And so, you know, you mentioned the title of the book. For me, it referred both to the immediate family of Norma and her daughters, and also to the larger sort of American family, the tens of millions of people whose lives are connected in some way to Roe. And I tried, of course, as any good journalist does, to tell the macro through the micro, to tell that larger story through this sort of immediate family.
Yeah, I really enjoyed getting to know so many of the participants in the case. There are folks who pop up, attorneys on both sides, and also sort of ancillary legal figures like Gloria Allred, whom a lot of people are more familiar with recently for her role in the Me Too movement. But I did not know the story of her involvement with Roe versus Wade, and it is, wow. There are names that I had heard before but didn't have a lot of depth on, like Curtis Boyd, who is a doctor who has performed abortions almost exclusively during his career, and for whom this is a mission, as well as folks who follow reproductive rights issues may have heard the name, but to know who he is and how his journey was affected by Roe. But also folks like, I have to say her full name, Dr. Mildred Fay Jefferson.
She would have appreciated that you said the full name.
Yes, and she is such an astonishing figure in the anti-abortion movement, and really a poignant figure in any reckoning of America and how it treats people, especially women of color. There may be folks here who are old enough to remember when she was playing a role in the movement, but can you explain who she was for those who aren't?
Sure. She was an utterly remarkable woman, and someone it was very challenging to write about because she was like a cipher. She was the single most important person in the pro-life movement for decades, and yet no one knew who she was or anything about her. That's when she was very young and very beautiful, and the first Black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School. And so she grew up in a small town in Texas, and she was very precocious and very brilliant. She graduated from college at 18, summa cum laude, and then after a few years at Tufts, because no Black woman had been admitted yet to Harvard Medical School, and she knew where she wanted to go. She then applied and got into Harvard Medical School in 1947. And what was so moving and sad was that here was a woman the pro-life side reveres, because she was, as I say, really the architect of the movement. She, more than anyone, politicized abortion and Republicanized it. She brought Ronald Reagan into the fold. She foresaw the importance of PACs, and I mean, on and on and on we can speak about her. But what happened was she had not imagined a life connected to abortion in any way. She wanted to be a surgeon, but she was never. It took years, in fact, decades, for her to become certified. And the reason for that, I learned in an FBI file of hers that I got, was misogyny and racism that was so intense that the doctors spoke openly of it in their interviews with this FBI person who was speaking to them when in 1973, President Nixon was thinking of appointing Dr. Jefferson to a panel. And she had always just spoken about her self-determination, and if you will it, it is no dream, you can do whatever you wish. But she ran up against sort of institutionalized racism and misogyny that really sabotaged her career. And she had other secrets too. She didn't speak about that. And the other secrets were that she was a hoarder, which was very difficult for her life. And also she had fallen in love with a white man when interracial marriage was illegal in more than half the country. And when they and still was, I think, when they married in 1962, her life was very difficult. And she told her then husband that because life was so unjust, she would not bring a child into this world. Now that stands at odds with everything she later publicly stood for. But here's this woman who really is at a loss for what to do. And then the American Medical Association in 1970 basically says, hey, doctors, if your state says that you ought to perform abortions, then you ought to perform abortions. Previously, it had not said that. Mildred was disgusted by this, and she was sort of recruited to join the pro-life movement. And she very quickly becomes its sort of most engaging and brilliant speaker. And what was so fascinating to me is that the very parts of her biography that were such obstacles in the world of medicine were enormous assets in the world of the pro-life movement, because that was a world of white Catholic men who were desperate to sort of appeal to others. And here was a Black Methodist woman. And so that was another thing that sort of helped her make this switch. But she had a very sad life. And to her dying day, she lied and told people that the reason she had not had children was that she'd not been able to conceive, not that she'd not chosen to conceive. And without going into a whole other biography now, Curtis Boyd, just as I sort of used Mildred sort of as the prism through which to look at the entire pro-life movement, so too I did that with Curtis Boyd. I wanted to be able to humanize abortion in America. I wanted people who read my book to understand how we got here through the lives of these people, and to sort of, you end up caring about them and even rooting them on, even if they're not on the side of the issue that you are on. And I found myself doing that. I happen to be personally pro-choice. I mentioned that in passing in the author's note, but I think I did a very good job, if I may say, of sort of keeping myself out of it. And that is sort of borne out by the letters I've been receiving, which are very gratifying to me. People feeling that I wrote about both sides with empathy and understanding.
The family that Norma McCorvey in some ways tried very hard not to have is in some ways a main character in this book. And there's I was wondering if I could ask you to read from the book at a remarkable place where Norma McCorvey's three daughters meet. And it's a moment that you definitely had a role in. It's I would say participatory journalism at its finest. Do you want to set this up for us before you read?
Sure. I will tell you that I am among the journalists who do not sort of want to be mentioned in their work. And so I am only in my book when it would be disingenuous for me not to be. But you're right. This is a moment where I sort of had to be. Norma, as I mentioned, had 3 children with 3 different men. They had looked for each other in vain for many years. 2 of them had sort of found each other, but then lost contact and had never met. And when I began my work on this, and I first reached out to the Roe baby, to Shelley, she did not want to participate. And I said, look, I will never write about you against your wishes. I had first reached out to her mother, who told me that, yes, she knows who she was born to. The reason she knows that is because when she was 18 years old, the National Enquirer came upon her in a parking lot near where she lived in Washington State, and told her that they'd be writing about her whether she wanted them to or not. In the end, she was able to prevail upon them with the help of a lawyer not to have her name mentioned. But forevermore, she carried this sort of burden, worried that she would be outed, and mindful that she was seen as a symbol for the other side, for the pro-life side. That was a very difficult thing for her. But then when I found her two other sisters and brought them together and met with them, I let her mother know that. And very soon thereafter, I got a phone call from Shelley saying that she did wish to participate in my book and that she did wish to meet them. And I'll just read about the day when they finally come together. By the way, when I started this 11 years ago, I did not use reading glasses. Years have passed. Okay. This was March 14th, 2013. It was noon when the sisters stood at Melissa's door. Kin come at last. Melissa was the eldest, Jennifer the middle, and Shelley the youngest. Melissa was teary as she hugged Shelley, then Jennifer, and Eric, that's Melissa's partner, handed each a potted rose bush, the blooms red as blood. The three sisters sat on a couch, Melissa in the middle. They were similarly sized, pink, blue, and black t-shirts covering medium torsos, their 6 feet not quite reaching the floor. Yet, side by side, their differences emerged. The chins round and receded and cleft, for example, that recalled Woody, Pete, and Bill, their biological fathers. Melissa had readied photo albums. As the sisters turned the pages, pointing and laughing at relatives unknown yet familiar, their discussion again flowed from physical bodies to experiences, the tubes Jennifer and Shelley had tied, the abuse and infidelities Melissa and Jennifer had endured, the desperate hopes that each of them had had of finding one another. An hour had passed when Melissa sat on her granite countertop, a stack of old letters, the sisters beginning to read aloud what the youngest of them had written the oldest 20 years before. Jennifer came upon mention of her sisters looking for her. The middle sister they had named Sarah, and began to cry. Eric and Melissa were preparing a feast. Pork ribs, macaroni and cheese, baked beans, potato salad, rice with pork liver and green onions, frosted carrot cake. But dinner was not quite ready, and the sisters walked outside. Shelley joked that she would move into the lot next door. Then, together with Jennifer and Melissa, she crossed the street to a playground. The sisters did not know that playgrounds had long tormented their birth mother, that they reminded her of Roe when empty and of her lost daughters, them, when full. They did not know, as they settled into the rubber seats of a swing set, that the logo Norma had chosen for her ministry was a girl on a swing. They knew only that they were at last together. And on this warm and breezy Texas afternoon, Melissa, Jennifer, and Shelley, faces to the sun, began to sway, to bend their knees and pump their legs, their feet brushing wood chips, their hands gripping warm metal ropes. The sisters, women become girls, smiling and laughing and rising to the sky.
If you're just joining in on the Zoom, the book is The Family Roe, an American Story. Joshua Prager is the author. You know, people who say family is everything, I think really need to get up close with an experience like that before. I mean, I'm not saying that statement isn't true, but it's certainly something that you don't take lightly after understanding what these three women and their mother went through over time. There's so much richness to this story and so much complexity. At the same time, I wondered about using Norma McCorvey's experience as a lens for reproductive rights ultimately does for us. People who are involved in any kind of pregnancy counseling will tell you that there are 1,000 stories. You know, there's some elements of sameness, but everything's just a little bit different. And we as Americans had no choice but to be a part of the Family Roe, as you say, because of our relationship to the decision and the law. But at the same time, do you find that if our understanding of abortion rights, okay, if we say that it's not limited by the circumstances of Norma and her life, is it at least shaped by it in a way that may not take into account all the issues that we ought to think of?
Well, it was very gratifying to me when the New York Times mentioned in its review that my book was, for the reviewer, a century-long argument for women's autonomy over themselves. And at no point do I write that, but when you see what the inability to sort of have an abortion did to successive generations in Norma's family, you come away, I think, really shaken by this in human terms. And I mention that because you're 100% right. Norma was not exactly who the pro-choice movement would choose now, had they the chance to do it all over again. But interestingly enough, maybe that's really the way it ought to be, because
Nor was she, sorry for interrupting, but nor was she the protagonist that the pro-life movement would have chosen. She was a gay woman and made no bones about it.
Absolutely. And they made her, as I said, renounce her homosexuality when she switched over to the other side. And it devastated her to literally her dying day. I was with her, and this was something that she never got over. And it was a horror. There at the time in 1969, when the lawyer Linda Coffey was looking for a plaintiff, she was desperate and was striking out. She could not find someone. You needed to find somebody who not only said, the hell with the stigma, I'm coming forward, because, yes, she had a pseudonym, but her anonymity could not be assured. And she had to also not be able to afford to fly to those places where abortion was legal. For example, in California, where abortion was legal through the 20th week of pregnancy. Governor Reagan had signed that law into effect, which was what was so interesting was it had broad bipartisan support, Republican and Democrats backing it. So finally, it was Norma's adoption attorney, Henry McCluskey, who knew Linda Coffey from law school, who introduced Linda to Norma. Interestingly enough, all three of them were gay: Linda, Norma, and Henry. And that's not a coincidence, because the sort of fight for, gay rights was also ongoing. And these were the sort of overlapping worlds here. No one, by the way, would have believed it if you told them then that 50 years hence, gay marriage would be almost ho-hum and Roe would still be sort of being fought over. But and I think there are reasons for that. The fact that one is so stigmatized because people don't, even though tens of millions of women and girls have had abortions, they don't talk about them for the most part. Whereas we all know someone, our friend, our brother, our father, who's gay, and it's impossible to sort of not know somebody who's benefited from the legalization of gay marriage. In fact, I'll just say the epigraph from my book speaks to that. It's from Melville, Moby Dick, and he writes, "See how elastic our stiff prejudices grow when love once comes to bend them." That basically it's impossible to be prejudiced against somebody if you know them, you love them, you care for them. Well, finally, Norma, Linda Coffey names Norma Jane Roe. And it was right about that time that there was one other sort of potential plaintiff who stepped forward, Mary Doe. Her real name was Marcia King, she and her husband. But she was ruled not to have legal standing, because she was not pregnant at the time the case was filed. And so Norma ended up being the person who became the plaintiff. And what was so sad for me as a person who was sort of obviously invested in one side of this was that when Norma then decided many years later in the mid to late 80s that she wanted to sort of step out from the shadows and be part of the movement had no use for her. She was marginalized. She was later exploited enormously by the pro-life side, but the pro-choice didn't give her a seat at the table. Understandably, in part because she lied. She had said among other things, that she had been raped, and that's how she conceived when she was pregnant with the Roe baby. But she had recanted that lie, and they still didn't give her a seat at the table, even after she then tried desperately and devoted herself for years. And there's a famous sociologist, Kristen Luker, who wrote about the divide, the class divide between the pro-choice and the pro-life sides. That ultimately comes down to class, education, things like that. Well, there's also, unfortunately, a class divide in the pro-choice side. And Norma was not the woman who the leaders of the pro-choice movement had in mind.
You mentioned the Times Review, and I'm glad there were a couple of things that struck me about it too. Anand Giridharadas, I'm never quite sure if I'm saying his name correctly. I hope I got it a little close there. He noted about your book that this is a story by a man, and conventional wisdom is changing about who tells stories, and maybe especially who tells women's stories. Was there ever a point in this odyssey that you had with the book, if you asked yourself if you were the right person to write this book?
So it's a very good question. And I'll be honest, when I started, I had no idea what I was getting into. I thought I was writing an article about the Roe baby. And then, as I say, that led to the sisters, and then Norma, and then Roe. And the next thing I know, I'm 5 years in and I'm writing this book. And also the national conversation about exactly this was sort of changing. And my way to deal with this was to address it within the narrative of the book. So over and again, the sort of careful reader will notice that I'm doing that. To give a few examples, I write about how the American Medical Association, which for years was the sort of arbiter of whether abortion was legal or not, the legal exceptions were therapeutic abortion, that it was all men. Here were men making these decisions for women. I write about how when Sarah Weddington was 26 years old, arguing the case in the Supreme Court, she looked up at the bench and these 9 men looked down at her. She literally felt them looking her over, she wrote, and wondered, how did she appear to them? I write about how the writer Katha Pollitt notes that in depictions of abortion, male writers are often sort of using abortion as a symbol of alienation or of other things, whereas women are writing about it in the sort of, immediacy of the moment, this very physical thing that they are enduring and choosing to do, et cetera, et cetera. And that was how I wrote about it. I do not use these abortions that come up over and again throughout the book as symbols into larger, discussions about male fragility or whatever. I write about what it means to want to have an abortion, whether it's 1926, 1969, or now. And depending on where you live, obviously geography is a big part of this. So that was sort of how I dealt with that.
When I said that I thought this book was a huge reporting achievement, it was because there's a great deal here in terms of the biographies of all the characters that you introduce us to. But I was also thinking about the many, many, many conflicting agendas that you had to wade through. Oh. This is one of, if not the most polarizing issue of our time.
Yeah.
And you were out to get just a very straightforward what actually happened story out of people who had a million different reasons to try to convince you of things about their views, or who might have been outright hostile to you. And I'm not necessarily talking about just pro-life people. There are a lot of folks in the pro-choice movement who are very suspicious of others telling a story that they're very much about. How did you do it?
It was the most difficult thing I've ever had to do. And I was in Tehran trying to find a story that would have not pleased their government. So it was very hard. I had to educate myself. I read tens of thousands of pages so that I could speak with knowledge about people. So if the pro-life world is speaking to me about post-abortion syndrome, the sort of, alleged condition, the syndrome that says that women who have abortions struggle with depression, I was able to first listen and get them to tell me that story, because the people who came up with those that sort of alleged syndrome have never given interviews before. Vincent Rue and Alan Parker, and their lives, by the way, Norma was a remarkable person to write about, because her life went into all of these lives in organic ways we could speak about. Actually, it's very important what happened with this thing, post-abortion syndrome, in terms of Norma. But then I was able to say, well, actually, endless studies show that the overwhelming majority of women who have abortions report feeling relief, not regret. And in fact, you, sir, who say that, a woman who does not wish to carry the child ought to sort of relinquish that child to adoption, you ought to know that studies also show that, the birth mother of sort of adopted children, they do often report feeling enormous sadness and guilt and depression and anxiety, etc. So first I was able to sort of get people to tell me their stories. And then I was able to scythe my way through the propaganda and the rhetoric to sort of get at the truth. It was kind of like a 1-2 punch. And yet, if I may say, I was never disrespectful. I enabled people to tell me their story. And that starts with language. As you've noticed, I use the phrase pro-life and pro-choice. Both sides think that the other person's phrase is sort of a mockery of who they are, but I felt that people are allowed to sort of call themselves who they are. At the same time, I point out why someone would say, for example, that the term pro-life is ridiculous and hypocritical, but I allowed people to call themselves that. And it was very difficult. You had someone like Randall Terry, who is the founder of Operation Rescue, literally telling his listeners on his radio program that I'm a criminal. I had to send him an email. I wanted it in writing. I sent him an email saying, that when you do that, that's dangerous, literally dangerous. There are people who have murdered people in your name. So please stop that. And then on the other side, just to say one prominent example, Sarah Weddington is the only person on either side who would not speak with me. And that is because I pointed out, as a journalist should, that over and again, she lied over these years. And she mistreated Norma, and she mistreated her co-counsel, Linda Coffey. And I needed to tell that story. And so I was fair and sort of empathetic, I think, but also tough when I had to be. And it was very difficult, many hundreds of interviews. But after a while, as the years were passing, the two sides sort of came to know of this crazy person who's working on this book. And they knew the book was coming out anyway. So they felt, hey, I may as well speak to the guy. And they did.
One of the things that really, it bedevils some writers of nonfiction, and certainly some reporters, is true in any working newsroom, is the search for not a perfect protagonist or a perfect narrator, but a really good one, and one that your audience, whether it's a reader or a viewer or a listener, can trust. And oh boy, is Norma McCorvey like one of the great complicated protagonists in modern history. You've said, and there are lots and lots of examples in the book of how she misrepresented facts of her life, how she misrepresented how she felt about things. And you really pull off something remarkable in helping us to understand her a bit and understand her orientation. I'm not going to say I understand why Norma said all the things she did over the years for and against abortion. And I'm certainly not going to say that I understand how she changed sides. There could be some very and have been some very cynical reads on this story over the years. Could you say a little bit about showing people many sides of Norma, and the other? I guess this is true of how you handle some of the other characters these are actually people, and how you handled all these many people that you wrote about, both giving them their due and showing us their flaws.
Yeah, Norma was a remarkable person, and what helped me was, as time passed, I came to understand, I had an aha moment a few years in, where I came to understand why she kept lying. So first I got at the truth, but then I thought I understood why. So to give a few examples of the lies I'm referring to, I mentioned that she said her child was kidnapped when in fact the child, she begged her mother to take the child off her hands. Another example, she had a consensual affair when she was in Catholic school. Actually, it was a one-night stand with a woman who was about to become a nun. She later said that she was raped. Well, and I could go on and on and on. And all of these examples had something in common, I realized. She was reimagining herself not as a sinner, but as a victim. And because sex had been, as I said, something so sinful and illicit, she sort of wanted to rid herself of that, and sort of reimagined herself in a way that would be befitting her pseudonym, Jane Roe. Even when something is it's not silly, it was a shooting, but something as ludicrous as there was a shooting in her house because of a drug deal, and she was dealing drugs at the time, selling pot, and she told everyone that she was shot at because she was Jane Roe, and there was that big story in the New York Times. She told Terry Gross that when she wanted to have an abortion, she went 1969, she found a clinic, and it had just been shuttered, and there was dried blood on the floor, and it reeked of death. Well, the truth was that she had found a safe abortion provider in Texas pre-Roe, but she couldn't afford it. It was $500. So, I just first had to sort of get to the bottom of what happened. And I did that with those papers I found. I did it by finding, an endless number of people who were reliable witnesses to her life, people who were in her life as the years passed. And I did it by always going back, as any journalist would, to the very earliest recollections that I could find in writing, which were remarkable. So in 1981, she told the truth about that abortion clinic. 15 years later, she was telling people about how it reeked of death. But she, I came to understand her. Meeting her mother was so sad and painful. This woman whose life, as we said, had been redirected by her unwanted pregnancy, but who beat Norma because she was gay. And Norma said to me, that she never had a mother. She didn't know how to mother because she never had a mother. One thing that was so moving to me was Norma's eldest child, Melissa, was sort of desperate to stop this multi-generational pattern. Even though she was married to a cretin who beat her, she extricated herself from that relationship. And even though she really didn't have a mother to speak of, she was and is a good mother to her children. And she even found it within herself to take care of Norma at the end of Norma's life, which was very, very moving to me, something heroic that I think tens of millions of people in this country are able to do. She found that within herself. So Norma, yes, but getting back to just Norma, I'll just say, I also felt for her because she was a person who struggled with various sort of anxieties and depressions. Her experiences were so difficult. She was a prostitute for a time. She'd never sort of told that to anyone. And yet she sort of managed to take pride in this law. She called it my law. And even though as the years went by and she switched and she said whatever someone paid her to do, there was real conviction there. It wasn't just, I know this not only because she said it to me at the end of her life from literally her deathbed. I was with her when she died and also in the weeks leading up to it. But also she said it, and I'll tell you what it is. She said it in her first interview that she ever gave after Roe, a few days after Roe in 1973. And then to the horror of her new friends at Operation Rescue, she said it again right after she about-faced and she was on Nightline with Ted Koppel. And what that was that she believed that abortion ought to be legal through the first trimester only. So she didn't please the people on the pro-choice side. She didn't please the people on the pro-life side, but she at least in this one way had conviction. She was true to herself. And what's fascinating is that is what, the majority of Americans believe and feel. And so in this way, she really did represent what she called the sort of mushy middle, that majoritarian middle ground. And that was helpful to me as well.
To everyone joining us via Zoom, you should know I could go on with this guy all night. So please do continue to add your questions through the Q&A function. If you're looking at the screen down around the bottom where there's a chat option, there's also one that says Q&A, and that's where we're looking forward to taking your questions. Let's start from one. Anne writes, "How has writing this book personally affected you?"
Oh, wow. So setting aside that I've been married now for 8 years and my wife has never known me not writing this book.
Oh, my sympathies, Mrs. Prager.
Yeah, exactly. So setting that aside, and what a relief to finally be done with it, it opened my eyes to a lot of things. I mentioned, for example, the abortion adoption sort of information that's so fascinating that all of a sudden I said, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I'll tell you something else. I had never really examined Roe for myself and what I think about it. And my ideal scenario, personally, is what they have in Western Europe, where the cutoff for legal adoption is somewhat earlier in pregnancy. However, and this is an enormous however, and why it is not fair to make the comparison with America and Western Europe, and why I would cling to Roe. The however is, until that point that abortion is legal, even though it's earlier in their pregnancy, not only does the state not throw like one obstacle after another at the poor sort of girl or woman who wants to have an abortion, but they help her to. Abortion is pretty much available in every hospital. It's free. And as I say, you don't have to sort of get consent from this person or that person, and on and on and on and on. So it's not homologous in any way. But I had not sort of examined my own thinking on it. And that was helpful to me to know this, to know the sort of truth about abortion. There are things in this book, just because abortion is a complicated and fraught thing, that are going to be pleasing to the advocate on one side and pleasing to the advocate on this side. So when I write about, for example, disposing fetal tissue, how do all these abortion clinics do it? It's complicated and somewhat grisly, and it makes you think about certain things. It just does. You'd not be a human being if it didn't. On the other side, I write about these ghastly, quote unquote, like memorials for fetuses, where the pro-life trot out these fetuses that they keep in formaldehyde. It's horrible. And that's making all sorts of people wince on the other side. So, I did my best through these characters, Boyd and Linda Coffey and Mildred Jefferson and Norma, of course, to sort of tell this story through their lives.
Hey, Josh, it's Bob Giles.
Hi.
How are you? So
Good.
nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Josh, my question is not about your important new book, but it's about baseball. In 2006, I remember our conversations about this. You wrote a book called The Echoing Green, in which you revealed that in 1951, the New York Giants were stealing signs in their final game against the Brooklyn Dodgers that decided the National League pennant. That game ended dramatically with a ninth inning home run by Giants players Bobby Thompson. It was known as the shot heard round the world. And how ironic it is that 70 years later, one of the teams now playing in the 2021 World Series, Houston Astros, was found to have been stealing signs from the Los Angeles Dodgers in the 2017 series. So tell us about your discovery of the cheating in the Echoing Green and your thoughts about the Houston Astros of today.
Yeah.
Before I hate to interrupt here, but Josh, could you just explain how you know Bob?
Yes. So Bob was the magical man who changed my life by giving me a Neiman Fellowship, and I will forever be in his debt. We did have wonderful conversations, Bob, not only about this baseball book, but even I remember I had just started to think about the Roe book back in 2010, 11, and we spoke about that too. So, it is a wild thing when you devote years to writing something, and then it sort of comes back up again, and all of a sudden people look again at a book you'd written. And what was so interesting to me about that baseball game, and I did sort of reveal, yes, how this sort of iconic team had cheated. So many years had passed, 50 years had passed when I looked at that, 49 and a half years. And it's the same thing here. It's literally 49 years now since Roe was filed, 50 years since Roe was filed. And people say, wow, how do you look back? People don't understand that it's actually easier. Time passes, people open up, archives open up. You can sort of, people are, and the public is ready to reassess something that it wouldn't have been ready to do years before. And that baseball game was an iconic game. It was interesting. It grew out of an article I wrote for the Wall Street Journal. And when I wrote that article, it was like America went bonkers. And I was trying to understand the reaction to it. And I realized that everyone who was writing me was writing as if they were the 9 or 10-year-old young boy or girl they had been when they were rooting for those two teams and things that happened. And the sort of similar things, again, it's looking at people whose lives change in an instant. Bobby Thompson and Ralph Branca. Here, Shelley, the child who found out that she was the Roe baby. And just to say one thing to the listeners here, my life changed in an instant. I was 19 years old when I was in a bad bus accident, and I walk with a cane to this day. So it's something that I was very mindful of and think about. And of course, there was also a secret. But in terms of the nitty gritty of what I wrote about, it was actually amazing how incredibly similar the cheating scandals were, the systems that the Giants in 1951 set up and the Astros all those many years later. And it was very gratifying to me that obviously I wasn't the reason why, but my work was sort of cited over and again to show that this had been a problem baseball was facing for decades. And what was gratifying was baseball finally did something about it. Now there are obviously these players and managers were, the managers, not the players, the managers were sort of banned from the game for a year, et cetera. So I do think that, that felt very good for me.
Bob, we're going to let you go, but can I ask before you leave, did you, when that fellowship was on the table, did you know that the guy on the other end was capable of an 11-year journalistic odyssey like the Family Roe?
Well, he had done some great work, which is what really put him in the final group, out of which we chose the Neiman Fellows. And so he was a star in my mind and in the committee's mind. And as I recall, he was a pretty easy choice. We were delighted to have him in the program, and he became a good friend. I really enjoyed my conversations with him.
Thanks for the question, Bob. We really appreciate it. And thanks for coming.
You're welcome. See you, Josh.
Bye, thank you.
Please feel free to add more questions in the question and answer function on this Zoom call. We'd be glad to have them as we continue talking with Joshua Prager. Josh, while we wait, I cannot resist. You brought up earlier that someone said of the book that that this book is very indicative and instructive on what happens when women don't have control of their bodies.
Yeah.
I don't really argue with that, but the thing that really clubbed me over the head was the truth that if people are in cultural situations where they do not talk about sex, they can be clobbered, whether they are male or female, gay or straight. It's not, I wouldn't call it the main theme of the book, but there's a study of repression here that I just found absolutely chilling, even though I feel like somebody who's thought about that stuff a lot. I'm sure that not everybody you talk to sees the issue in those terms, but it's such a strong thread, that informs many aspects of abortion rights. Are you comfortable that the people you talk to would approve of the conclusions that you drew about that?
I think Roe in some ways is a Rorschach. I mentioned that I think I called that like way in the beginning. And I think, which is fascinating to me, my book is sort of proving that way a little bit too. People are really seeing in it different things. I'm really glad though you mentioned repression, because I was mindful of that. And there's one time where I write about something that was really fascinating. At the end of Norma's life, she bounced around a lot in different towns. And one of the towns she lived in, always by herself, she was now at this point separated from Connie. she lived in a town called Smithville. And she was still, again, sort of ostensibly representing the pro-life side of things, but she was pushing them away more and more and divorcing herself more and more from Roe. Well, in this town, she met a couple, a gay couple that owned a cafe where the prices were merely suggested, and they lived an authentic life. They were true to themselves. And they sort of reminded Norma more than anyone had ever done so before that she had run away from who she was, and not only run away from Connie, but run away from her homosexuality. Norma publicly repudiated it over and again and said sort of horrible, miserable things, basically echoed the things that the pro-life world was whispering in her ear. And one of the times that we went out, I was interviewing her, we went out for dinner, and she just sort of started flirting with our waitress. And the woman left, and Norma turned to me and she said, why have I done this? Why did I let religion sort of dictate my life? And it was so sad. And this was a woman who was so unabashedly who she was when she was a kid. It took guts to be out in Texas in the 1960s, which she was part of this sort of wonderful scene that I describe in the book. And she had sort of thrown that all away. And Roe obviously speaks right to that. You know, there's a great irony to Roe v. Wade, because it's grounded in a right to privacy. And that privacy is a problem, because yes, you are, if you have an abortion, it is entirely your right to never tell anyone about it. But because the overwhelming majority of people do not speak about it, it remains shrouded in privacy, and thus easier for half of the country to say we have nothing to do with this, which is of course not true. And I write a lot about that in the book too. But it is a difficult thing, and you've hit on one of the central themes.
Paulette writes to ask, how did you organize and keep track of all of those interviews and tell a cohesive story? Paulette, I'm so delighted you asked this. I was curious myself, but I thought it was too much of a reporter nerdy question. Josh, what do you say?
You know, it was a lot. I have about 6,000 pages of notes. And they are small writing on, you know, it's a lot, and not little notebook pages, like large pages of notes. And what ended up happening was I was able to sort of organize the book through people. So Linda Coffey sort of helps me tell the story of the law. Mildred Jefferson of the pro-life world, Curtis Boyd of the pro-choice world. And they're each so important that they can sort of carry that load. And also their stories are just so compelling. We didn't touch on it, but Linda Coffey, this incredible person, really the matriarch of Roe v. Wade, she gets swallowed up by Sarah Weddington's story because Sarah Weddington loves the spotlight and Linda Coffey hates it. And when I found Linda, she was living in a house without heat and living on food stamps in East Texas, this incredibly important person. And Curtis Boyd, similarly, he's now the largest provider of third trimester abortion in America. He became the provider of third trimester abortion after his friend George Tiller was murdered. But what really was so important about him for me was, more than anyone else, he prefigured this shift in the pro-choice movement from saying that abortion ought to be safe, legal, and rare, as Bill Clinton said, to something that is only, as Curtis said, a social and moral good. It is something that empowers women and therefore is only a good. Anyway, I was able to sort of put these huge subjects and topics upon these people and sort of tell it in that organized way. And Norma, I'll just say the one thing I mentioned earlier, her life went through all these lives. So following her was just wonderful and easy to tell it chronologically through her. Obviously, she was crucial. She was Jane Roe to the pro-choice side, but on the pro-life side, you know, the pro-life argument has largely switched from being focused on the fetus to being focused on the pregnant woman. As I said, they say that if a woman has an abortion, she struggles with that sort of emotionally. And that argument has resonated with the court. With the Supreme Court, Justice Kennedy validated it in the 2007 case of Gonzalez v. Carhart. He cited an affidavit of a woman saying this, and that affidavit had been submitted to the court by a man named Alan Parker. And Alan Parker was Norma's lawyer, and it was Norma who enabled Alan Parker to sort of enter the judicial system and get his points out there. So Norma, I just sort of piggybacked her and her story, and away I went.
Right. Perhaps this is a good moment to ask a question from one of our audience members named Meredith. She offers, by the way, that her mother would have been the perfect plaintiff for Roe, as her doctor said her 7th pregnancy, which was wanted, would certainly kill her if it was continued.
Wow.
Meredith asks, though, if maybe Norma McCorvey was exactly the right case, because she was not what mainstream America might have considered a virtuous mother. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Abortion is legal for everyone, not just the sort of, perfect, well-educated, well-spoken person. And I think you're right. And not only that, if I may say, I think this is a failing on the part of the pro-choice movement. I think they need to do a better job of truly partnering, and I'm talking about the leaders in Washington and New York City and elsewhere, truly partnering with the abortion clinics that are on the front lines in Alabama and Texas and Mississippi. I spoke to these women. I quote one of them in the book, saying that they often don't feel that those people have their backs. And, yes, it's been helpful in a sense to the pro-choice movement in terms of fundraising that Roe is now so threatened. But I think that the pro-choice movement needs to do a better job with that. And I think they also, in so doing, need to just sort of be better to the person who is like Norma and, didn't go to Vassar, as she said. It was really ugly. There she would be in some Senate hearing where Roe would be spoken about, and the leaders were there, and she was just sort of a prop. They didn't let her speak. And that's why she was low-hanging fruit to the pro-life side. It is true that religion genuinely meant something to her, Catholicism in particular. She became evangelical and then Catholic. She liked her patron saints and her rosary beads and all that. But what she wanted to be was pro-choice and gay. And there was no room for her to be gay on the pro-life side. And the pro-choice side did not hug her and tell her that we appreciate you, whereas the pro-life side did over and over again. And that's something, I'll tell you another thing. To this day, to give another searing and sad example, they've never done anything to help Linda Coffey, who's living in poverty in East Texas. That's ridiculous. She's the one who filed Roe v. Wade. So I think that there's some things that the leaders there should do.
What was it like to be in finishing stages of this book as legal cases were marching through the court system in Texas and in Mississippi that would show us just how close we are to possibly the undoing of Roe versus Wade? I just want to note, just real quick, I just want to note that while Texas's new law is eating up most of the oxygen right now, many court watchers agree that the challenge coming out of Mississippi is more likely to be the one that the Supreme Court gets to first, and with possibly with a definitive answer on whether Roe will continue.
Yeah, the Supreme Court is actually hearing oral arguments in the Texas case on Monday, which is really nuts. And then you're right, Dobbs, the case out of Mississippi on December 1st. It was shocking to me as this was happening. When I started, Obama was just in his second, year in office, and Roe looked quite secure. the years pass, and then of course Trump is elected, and then first there's the sort of assured pick he has on the court because of Merrick Garland, and then there's another one, and then when Justice Ginsburg died, I said, oh my goodness, Roe is going to be overturned. And Norma believed that. She told me right before she died, which right after Trump got the nomination, she said that Richie Rich is going to get his way. That's what she called Trump. And I think he is too. I do. I'm not saying that this term, the Supreme Court is going to overturn Roe. I won't be shocked if they do with Dobbs. And you're right, Dobbs, the one out of Mississippi, is really the one that goes to the heart of Roe because it centers on the question of viability. And if you get rid of viability, Roe can still remain like good law, but only in name only, because then all pre-viability bans are fair game. And you can basically make abortion all but illegal in all those states that would do just that. So it really was a shock to me. And I felt sort of an urgency to get my book done. As long as it took me, I will tell you the truth, I could not have worked any harder. So it was very gratifying to have it come out now, to say that at least, with all of this going on, maybe my book can shed some light on some of what's going on.
In our lifetimes, and maybe even just during the course of your work on this book, the concept of viability has gone through some changes as medical science has changed and as technology in neonatal intensive care units have changed. Did you find yourself ever at a loss about what viability, whether viability was going to continue to be a moving target?
Well, what's really interesting is Justice O'Connor sort of famously said that Roe is on a collision course with itself, that because of technology, sort of fetuses and babies will be able to survive earlier and earlier into pregnancy. And you know what's remarkable? That hasn't really happened. What it used to be, the court determined when Roe was handed down, that viability was sort of weeks 24 to 28. Well, it's still pretty much week 24 now, because I quote a study from the New England Journal of Medicine just a few years ago that showed that before 24 weeks, fetal lungs just really struggle to function. And something only like, 15% of babies that are born at that stage don't suffer some major morbidity, even if they live. So in that sense, viability has not changed all that much. What has changed, sort of the technology enabling abortion providers to provide abortions later and later, obviously in pregnancy. When Roe made abortion legal until viability, it was all but impossible to have an abortion until viability. And among the things that Curtis Boyd did, the doctor I mentioned, he developed the standard method of second trimester abortion called dilation and evacuation. And so, that has changed enormously, and that has forced some of these sort of complicated moral questions to the fore.
One of our audience members asks, what can women do who need an abortion when the Supreme Court overturns Roe? There's a lot packed into that question, but
yeah,
if you'd like to take it on the face.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of getting an abortion, what will happen if the Supreme Court overturns Roe? It will go back to the states, and the states will be able to decide for themselves if they think abortion ought to be legal. And there are organizations like the Center for Reproductive Rights that have already given us a very clear sense of which states will go which way. And abortion will be all but illegal in about 23, 24 states, which means it will be legal in about half of the country. And so if you're in one of those states where abortion is not legal, you will then have to sort of get to a place where it is. And that is very difficult if you are a person who doesn't have a lot of money and has children and has a job, et cetera, et cetera. And there are organizations now that are working to help that and to help women who will be in that predicament. There are even abortion clinics that are moving closer to state lines where it is known that abortion will be illegal. So I think even more than we are now, we will soon be a nation even more divided.
In the course of your explaining the history of Roe versus Wade, and one of the things that was just fascinating in the book was your reconstruction of some of what the justices of the Supreme Court were thinking and what specifically what Justice Harry Blackmun, who wrote the opinion, had to, had on his mind, and your construction of some of the varying arguments from what documentation we have. You note that Roe versus Wade is based on only one of several legal foundations, that there were a number of different ways that Linda Coffey and Sarah Weddington might have gone about presenting the arguments. Do you think that we may not, if Roe is overturned, that we may not so much be up against an ultimatum forever, but just another series of battles entailing another set of legal arguments over the legality or the constitutionality of abortion?
Yeah, I don't think this is ending anytime soon, no matter what the Supreme Court does this term. And you're right, Justice Ginsburg, before she was on the Supreme Court, had famously said that abortion ought to have rested upon equality and not privacy, for example. I mean, there's just, it's so complicated. And one of the things that I also just, you mentioned Justice Blackmun, my mind went to this. One of the things that I think is very important is to know that justices are people too. Now, they would hate my saying this. They obviously, who the hell am I? But I'm just pointing out that they too are affected by their own personal experiences. Justice Blackmun, in the preamble to Roe, he wrote that personal experience affects the way a person relates to abortion. He says, what was it? He had a great phrase, the something of human, I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, he writes about it very sort of poetically. I even used the phrase as one of the chapter headings, one of the section headings in my book. But he does not mention that he himself had a daughter, Sally, who had found herself unhappily pregnant in college and had then hastily married, miscarried, divorced. He had also been the legal counsel at the Mayo Clinic, and pre-Roe had seen the devastating consequences of sort of back alley abortions. And I think that affected him enormously. There was another justice on the court, Justice Powell, who had came out years later when he was pre-Roe at a law firm, and one of the messenger boys at that firm came to him saying that he was wanted for manslaughter because his girlfriend had gotten pregnant and he had brought her to an illegal abortion provider and she had died. And these were both, I believe, Nixon appointees, and they were both obviously, as pro-choice as they come. And so, I mean, then again, the court was more Republican than Democrat, and they voted 7-2 in favor of Roe. So, but yeah, I do also believe that personal experience is an important way into these issues.
We are coming to the end of our time together tonight. I know I've been a little bit touchy, which I'm not supposed to, but again, I'm so deeply grateful. I felt like I could feel the work that went into every sentence and every chapter. The book, once again, is The Family Roe, An American Story by Joshua Prager, available now at fine booksellers near you. Joshua, I keep hearing that the publishing industry is in a period of scarcity and shortness. Would you recommend that if people want to get this in time for their winter breaks, they should find it sooner rather than later?
Absolutely. Thank you, April. That's very kind of you.
Shameless.
I do appreciate it. And I did work very hard. It obviously is a very good feeling. I actually have an article in tomorrow's New York Times connected to the book, which talks about how we are now obviously in a time of polarization. And back then, when Roe sort of came down the pike, people were able to to honestly speak about the fact and recognize the fact that abortion is fraught for good reason. And I mention that because there are not a lot of books, if I may say, like this, where you don't sort of on page one know that, okay, this is a screed. I'm going to, even if I agree with them, I know exactly where everything is coming from. This is going to make you sort of challenge some of your assumptions. And I think that's a good and healthy thing. I'm proud of it. And I just want to say, I know we're nearing the end. I really appreciate you having me on, and it's been an honor speaking with you, April. Thank you.
It's a pleasure for us, truly. And looking forward to reading your piece in the Times tomorrow. I want to thank Joshua and, of course, the National Writers Series, Jillian and Carl, and everybody who helped make this happen tonight. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here as well. Let's get a final word from Jillian.
I hope you'll all continue the conversation by purchasing a copy of The Family Roe from your favorite independent bookstore. Thank you again to our donors and major supporters: Cordia, West Shore Bank, the Northwest Michigan Arts and Culture Network, literary sponsor League of Women Voters of Leelanau County, Interlochen Public Radio, and the Traverse City Record Eagle. This event is also made possible in part by the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. And thanks to you, our viewers. Your support makes all the difference, and the proceeds of our event go to our Raising Writers programs to help share the love of reading and writing. Thank you, and good night.